Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture and the paranormal, coming to you from sunny West London. My name is Gordon and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, we get to do something I've been chasing for 21 episodes now, and that is to talk about Tolkien. Joining me from California is writer, artist, astrologer, editor of Archai, the Journal of Archetypal Cosmology, and doctoral student Becca Tarnas. Becca's current research is an examination of the convergence of images between Tolkien's work and Jung's work in his Red Book, as well as an exploration of the implications of such a convergence. Becca, thank you very much for your time.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me to come speak with you.
Always a pleasure, and I'm quite looking forward to the answer to the now traditional beginning question. Becca, were you a weird kid?
Well, I went to a Waldorf school in San Francisco from kindergarten actually all the way through high school. And I think that's a place where if you might be defined as a weird kid in another context, you're not weird. So I felt very at home in this particular form of education that just allowed me to explore my imagination and live into all of the different fantasies that I think childhood is so much about. So I never felt like a weird kid.
So to paraphrase Timothy Leary, you found the others early.
Yes, I did.
Nice one. Nice one.
Yeah.
So the video will be in the show notes of your presentation, but what I would like to ask is, when did you first encounter Tolkien?
Let's see. I was 9 years old, and my fourth grade teacher read us The Hobbit every day at lunch. And when I was listening to it, there was something that felt deeply familiar about this story. The names seemed to strike a very deep chord in me. Names like Rivendell and Dale. I felt like I'd been there before. And something about that sense of familiarity really, really stuck with me. And I think I came home one day and I told my mother that just how much I loved The Hobbit and how familiar Middle-earth felt to me. And she said, "Oh, wait till you read The Lord of the Rings." And I think it was about 3 years later that I first picked up The Fellowship of the Ring. And it felt like coming home. It's the best way I can describe it. That as I was reading the story, it was like I had already read it before, but I hadn't. And probably for the next 8 years, that story kind of illustrated my whole life. And as I was going through adolescence and the usual and unusual struggles that come with that, it was almost like The Lord of the Rings became the lens through which I was able to process those experiences. And I fell completely in love with that world and with that story. It really did become my myth. And of course, I was able to recognize how much it was the contemporary myth for so many other people too.
And was it, so once you caught the Tolkien bug, did you read other fantasy as well, or was it all Tolkien all the time?
Well, I think in those earlier years, I did try and read some other fantasy. I definitely was completely drawn into the world of Harry Potter, for example, and I am of that generation who got to grow up with Harry Potter and be the same age as him approximately through all of the books. So that was a really amazing experience. But in many ways, I didn't get into a huge range of fantasy. It was like I was looking for something that replicated that feeling that Tolkien's world gave me. So I loved Philip Pullman's, his Dark Materials trilogy, and Yeah, got into a few other stories, but there was something about Middle Earth that I just wanted to go deeper and deeper into that world. And I think as a teenager, there was something in me that was in denial that the Lord of the Rings was actually written by a human being. There was something in me that wanted it to be scripture or wanted it to be a true myth. And so it wasn't until I got older that I started researching who Tolkien was and what his experience was in writing this story. And of course that shifted a lot of things. But in those early years, I think I wanted to go as deeply into the Middle Earth realm as I possibly could.
Yeah, Becca, that's a remarkable parallel for my own sort of early discovery of Tolkien and kind of attempted forays into other fantasy worlds, but such as we can say these things, they weren't real because they weren't Middle Earth.
Yes.
And I'm right there. I'd read Lord of the Rings multiple times through my teenage years and did attempt to go deeper. I was probably too young the first time I read Lord of the Rings independently. And so my memories of the book are it emerging kind of through the gloom, because with each reread, I didn't know what a wain was the first time I read through, but the next time I did, I knew that was a wagon, and all these pieces came through on additional readings. But I'm right there with you. I mean, I'm too old to have grown up with Harry Potter, but there were other attempts of kind of fantasy stuff, and I liked them well enough. But I know what you mean. There was something about Middle Earth being home base that I never quite shook.
Yes. It is incomparable for the biased reader, I should say.
Yeah, that's for sure. So, we kind of gone through high school there. Let's pick up the autobiographical journey with college.
Mm. Well, I did my undergrad degree at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, and it was an interesting time period in my life. In terms of my relationship with Tolkien, I felt when I went to college that, okay, it's time to grow up. It's time to leave behind Middle Earth and step out into something else. And I was drawn to study theater because I think it allowed my imagination, which was so fed by Tolkien's stories, and other stories as well. The theater allowed that part of me to continue to develop and grow, and that I could become the characters that I most wanted to be. And so when I was in college, I studied theater. I was actually a double major. I did theater to fulfill that imaginal artistic desire. And then I did environmental studies as my second major. And that really tapped into this kind of deeper moral orientation. And in many ways, I think the combination of those two, of the ecological studies and the artistic theater studies, have joined each other and blended in a way in my life after college, and in many ways also still with my interest in Tolkien, because there is such an ecological ethic in his stories. And so it was like I was looking for that same feeling in the outer world and attempting to put it into practice in my college studies.
Well, unsurprisingly, given where you took yourself with this, your studies, that's extremely self-aware, because that would have been my observation, that you're bringing into the physical world a replication of a Middle Earth experience. Because the ecology thing in particular, I like that you use the word moral, because it's potentially, here we go, let's get, full Tolkien nerd. It's potentially an overly simplistic reading to say that his book, well, it is an overly simplistic reading to say that he was anti-technological and kind of yearning for this Tory bucolic fantasy. But he did certainly recognize the need for taking a moral position in the world, including nature. So that when you said that you focused on that word moral, talking about your eco studies, that definitely sounded very Tolkien-esque to me.
Yes, I think probably engaging with his work from such a young age instilled that in me. And also just where I grew up, I was born in Big Sur, California, which is a beautiful part of the world that has mountains and cliffs plunging into the ocean and redwood trees and beautiful canyons. And so I'd always been in love with the natural world. And I think that part of me found a home in Tolkien as well. And I also had a very pivotal moment right before I went to college, and that was working on a biodynamic farm in California and getting to really get my hands in the soil and working with the plants and getting to know weather patterns and having these beautiful relationships with the animals that lived on this farm. And so that also instilled in me this ecological ethic and really was a turning point in my life of how to put these things that I felt drawn toward already into practice.
Yeah, I like that. So growing up in the Big Sur area, were you, prior to discovering Tolkien, the little kid wandering off into the forest, talking to fairies, following butterflies, that kind of thing?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, whenever I would be in Big Sur, I was born there, but we moved up to the Bay Area when I was still pretty young, but I still had family members who lived in Big Sur. And so I would go back to Big Sur all the time. And I don't think I ever wore shoes.
Because I was going to say the biodynamic thing is more elvish than Hobbit, but then you had to throw in the shoe thing. And
right.
We're back to Hobbits.
I did farm barefoot some of the time. It's really wonderful to be able to just have your feet in contact with the soil and this sense of, as human beings, we are a species that has emerged from this earth, from this planet, and we do belong here.
Yeah, absolutely. So jumping forward again, tell me and the listeners about the two red books that you decided to focus on.
Well, when Jung's Red Book was published in 2009, I heard about it. I think I read a news article about it. And at the time, I was still in college, actually, doing my undergrad degree. So I was still living in Massachusetts. And I hadn't studied Jung at that point. But I knew that my father was very deeply involved with his work, and seeing this book, I just felt this sense, like, not that I had to have it, but that this book had to somehow be part of my life in a way. And so I called my brother and I said, let's get this huge, expensive red book for our dad. And so the book arrived, and as I was looking at it, I thought, this is out of Tolkien's world. It's called The Red Book, and for those who know The Lord of the Rings well, the story of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings is written down within the context of The Lord of the Rings in a book that started out as Bilbo's memoir, his personal journal. He's always talking about, I have to settle down and finish my book. And that book is The Red Book, and it's the story of The Hobbit, There and Back Again, written by Bilbo, and then the story of the War of the Ring, written by Frodo, and then the story is completed after Bilbo and Frodo sail away by Sam Gamgee. And then that book is passed on to his children, and a few copies are made, and that's called The Red Book of Westmarch. And so I already knew that, having spent all this time reading these different Tolkien works. And when I saw Jung's Red Book, something in me just felt like, this is it. Someone else wrote The Red Book of Westmarch. And it really just started off as an intuition, the same title, and something else really struck me as well, and that was the images. The images in Jung's Red Book had a style, a quality, a feeling, a use of color, a use of images such as dragons and trees and stars and this mandalic symmetry that I'd also seen in Tolkien's artwork. And that's really where it all started. I had this sense, wouldn't it be interesting to compare the two? And so I decided I would take this on as an independent study with one of the professors in my graduate program, Sean Kelly, and he was interested to go on this journey with me. And so I just sat down with Jung's Red Book and started reading it and working with the images and doing other research, and very quickly realized that there was a remarkable similarity in content, in symbolism, and in images. And then from there, as I was doing more research into the timing of Jung's Red Book, so he started having the visionary experiences, the fantasies that were brought forward by the method he eventually called active imagination. That started in 1913 and really went through the end of that decade, but he was working on the Red Book all the way until 1930. And looking at Tolkien's life, another interesting parallel emerged, and that was right about the same time, 1911, 12, 13. Tolkien was doing these very unusual imaginal drawings, these kind of symbolic pictures in a little sketchbook that he called the Book of Ishness. And there's no explanation of what these drawings mean, except that they have these fantastic titles, like before, afterwards, the end of the world, sleep, convention, undertenishness, grown-upishness, silent, enormous, and immense. These very amazing titles and these evocative images. And I started to wonder, well, how interesting is this, that it's the same years that Jung is having these profound visions emerge, and Tolkien is doing these very unusual drawings, which he hadn't done earlier in his life. He drew when he was younger. He drew landscapes and he drew gardens and buildings and so on. But there was this very sudden turn toward the imaginal, both in Tolkien and in Jung. And so my project in many ways is just tracing out the similarities, the parallels in timing, the parallels in the images, and just allowing that synchronicity to unfold.
The Book of Ishness is interesting because it does appear to be physical or archaeological, if you want, evidence that Tolkien was doing something. I mean, he was notoriously reticent to kind of, talk about where these ideas come from, and we'll get it to Smith of Wooten Major later, where even towards the end of his life, he's kind of leaving enigmatic clues about what he thinks about the imaginal. Mm-hmm. But there does appear to be evidence, and given, and what we'll talk about where, no, let's do it now. So Tolkien was kind of following a white rabbit. Middle-earth emerged, as you would well know, while he was marking papers, and just kind of wrote a little line about where, hobbits living in holes on the back of a exam paper. And so he was kind of pulling on a thread. And it is interesting then that the timings between the Red Book and the Book of Ishness line up, because you're dealing with people who had the most astonishing imagination, mm-hmm. Kind of mapping or exploring what appears to have elements of similar terrain at the same time, which potentially says something quite important.
Yes. Well, actually, Middle-earth emerged even before Tolkien wrote "In a Hole in the Ground There Lived a Hobbit." On the back of that exam paper, he encountered the name Erendil and the name Middle-earth in these two lines of an Anglo-Saxon poem. Amazingly, he read that in 1913.
Yeah.
The same year that Jung is having his first visionary experiences that lead into the Red Book. And it's in 1914, right as World War I is breaking out, that Tolkien, who's already been doing these drawings in the Book of Ishnis, that Tolkien writes the very first poem that in many ways becomes the seed of his whole Middle-earth mythology. And that is the poem, I believe it's entitled The Voyage of Arundel. And he talks about this figure who is the evening star who sails across the sky. And that, of course, is a pivotal character in the whole Middle-earth mythology. And in many ways, Arundel is the one who ties all of the narrative threads that run through the Silmarillion, beginning with the Ainu Lindale, the cosmogonic myth, weaving all the way through those stories of the Silmarillion that Christopher Tolkien edited and published in the version that came out in 1977, but then we have all of the earlier drafts that Tolkien was writing during World War I that are now published in the wonderful 12 volumes, The Histories of Middle-earth, that it's just such a great service and gift that Christopher Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien's son, put together and made available to the world. And so Middle-earth, in many ways, was discovered by Tolkien the exact same year that the deep unconscious was discovered by Jung. And I think that is a very profound synchronicity and maybe indicates something about the nature of our world.
Well, especially as Arundel is not just the evening star. You're an astrologer, you know the evening star is also the morning star and Venus. And so it is the thing that precedes the dawn. It's esoterically it's John the Baptist. It's also, potentially where we get one of the influences on the name of Lucifer for. It's the thing that sort of shows that something else is coming. It is the initiatrix in this sense. And I didn't realize that was the exact same year. That's very interesting.
Yes. It is a profound synchronicity. And since you did bring up astrology, I will mention that, of course, one of the parallels that, or I should say, another overlapping synchronicity with what's happening for Jung and what's happening for Tolkien at this time is that for the whole world collectively, there is this alignment in the sky of Uranus opposite Neptune. And Uranus is the awakener that liberates, that brings in what is new, that initiates things. And Neptune is the archetype of the imaginal, of the sacred, the transcendent, the spiritual. And so there is this profound awakening related to the archetype of Uranus into this imaginal realm that is happening all around the world in so many different forms for so many different people, coming through the arts, coming through literature, coming through religious and spiritual and cultural renewal. And it so happens that the parts of Jung's natal chart and the parts of Tolkien's natal chart that are being transited by this Uranus-Neptune alignment perfectly relate to the differences, both the similarities and the differences in their experiences. And just since you brought up Venus and that Arundel is Venus, I find it pretty amazing that Uranus-Neptune opposition in the sky was crossing Tolkien's natal Venus at this time. And so it's this awakening, again associated with Uranus, of Tolkien's Venus, which comes through as Arundel, but Venus archetypally relates to the arts, to poetry, And that is the mode that he finds and that he expresses himself through, is this romantic, poetic mode that is so much associated with the Venusian archetype.
There are also some other similarities in the dreamscape that are kind of around that time, to do with, speaking of Neptune, to do with waves, if you'd want to kind of talk about that.
Yes. Well, one of the parallel experiences that Jung and Tolkien were having at that time, we have the exact dates of Jung's experiences. I think Tolkien's parallel experience of this was spread over a longer period of time. And so what that is Jung started getting these visions of a great flood covering the northern lands in Europe. And for him, the first time this vision came through was on a train journey. It was October 17th of 1913. And he had this overpowering vision of a wave, a flood coming in over the northern lands and bringing absolute destruction. And in the vision, the water, which is carrying all this rubble of civilization, turns to blood. And about 2 weeks later, he had the same vision again, and he heard a voice that was telling him that he needs to look at this carefully, that this will be so. And for Jung, he feels like at this particular time, perhaps he is going insane. And he takes this as a personal premonition. But within the next year, as the First World War breaks out, he realizes that he is actually tapping into the collective, and that this wave of destruction covering Northern Europe is actually the wave of destruction brought by the First World War. Now, Tolkien, throughout his life, I believe beginning in childhood, would have these overpowering dreams of a great wave that, again, would just rush in, bringing destruction over the landscape. And he called this his Atlantis Haunting. And it seems that he had these visions when in sleeping dreams, and there's also the possibility that it may have come to him as he was awake as well, kind of, visionary fantasies. And there isn't direct evidence that Tolkien never explicitly says that he was having waking visions. And so I don't want to directly claim that. Whereas, of course, we have a very clear idea of what was going on for Jung, because he tells us that. With Tolkien, it's more looking at what he's writing, what he's drawing, and then knowing that some of this is coming from dreams and sleep, and that this is certainly emerging through his imagination. But exactly how he was experiencing that, we don't know. And I want to leave that to be the mystery, as he wanted or didn't want it told. But so just to get back to the Great Wave, Tolkien would have these dreams and possibly waking visions of this great flood, and they stopped when he finally wrote about it. And this was, of course, in telling the story of the downfall of Numenor, the kind of Atlantis-like island that is in the ocean and is gifted to the human beings who helped in the wars against the Dark Lord, helped the elves and helped the Valar in the first age of Middle-earth.
And was given to Miranda Otto to say as Eowyn in the film, and I think she did a reasonably good job of it. Yes.
I enjoy seeing how in writing the scripts for the film, there are certain lines that are either Tolkien's direct narrative text or a quote that is said by someone else, but it's given to another character, and then you can see it in a new light. In the book, it's Faramir who has the vision, and he tells Éowyn. And in the film, it's Éowyn herself who is having the vision. Of course, as far as lineage goes, it makes sense that it would be Faramir who's having the vision, because in him, the blood of Numenor seems to run true. And so he's tapping directly into his Numenorian ancestry, and has this kind of, it's interesting, it's a very Jungian idea in many ways, that Faramir is carrying this collective memory that comes out of his own personal lineage.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a wonderful way of kind of deepening the films, that they'll do that with the words, sometimes intentionally. I know Miranda Otto was told that this was a dream that Tolkien actually had before she actually played it, which I think really helped. But you kind of get an echo of the personality through it. It's the bloodline, as you say, the Jungian thing is interesting, and as is the ending of the wave dreams after he wrote about it. Because are you familiar with Al Malou?
Is it Aulamu?
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So this, yes, I think, goes one of the parallels, one of the few that Tolkien will admit to, or I don't think he realized at the time when Jung was, in his tower, which we'll get to. There were regular poltergeist effects and other strange things that even happen with psychotherapy, that come with doing this kind of imaginal psychological work. And one of Tolkien's sons kept having, waking hallucination nightmares of a monstrous owl in his bedroom. And Tolkien drew it, and the owl went away. Now, that's all kinds of interesting, because the owl is the sort of, extra-dimensional UFO visitor, screen memory par excellence, like throughout history and certainly in modern UFO phenomena. The kind of presence of the extra-dimensional is often symbolized by an owl. And I find that interesting. And it kind of, the reason I brought that up is because it does sort of point to, I know we can, as to whether or not Tolkien would have waking dreams or sort of waking visionary experiences to do with the wave. You're right, we'll never know. But, his son did. His son managed to have those those decidedly unpleasant visionary experiences. And that's a funny echo of Faramir having the Numenor dream.
And also, I believe it was the same son, Michael. I'll have to double check that. But after Tolkien stopped having the Great Wave Dream, his son Michael did start having it, and Tolkien found that out many years later. I know it was Michael that had the Great Wave Dream.
It's definitely Michael who had the owl dream too. So there we go. Okay. We worked it out. That's amazing. I didn't know that bit.
Yes. So that's another kind of interesting thing, that the dreams of the father are then passed on into the dreams of the son. And that writing it or drawing it, externalizing it creatively in some way, helps to give it form, allow it to be in the world. And again, this is so much of what Jung is doing too, with his Red Book and with his paintings, and of course what he was encouraging his patients to do as well with their visions.
Well, absolutely. So we don't really know much about that psychic exploration process. Well, we don't know as much about that process with Tolkien as we do with Jung. But how did describe the kind of, a top-line description of how Jung sort of created the Red Book and the paintings, because it was a hugely long process that he considered to be the most important thing he did with his life. But there was a very specific combination of bringing into the real world stuff that he'd actually encountered by going into the imaginal. So, as far as we know, how did he do that? Did he, lie down like Edgar Cayce? Do you know how he did his thing? He,
as far as I know, he would sit at his desk late at night, and it's debatable. Sonu Shamdasani, who is the wonderful editor of the Red Book, he feels that the evidence kind of points to that Jung was probably writing for much of these experiences. And so he's kind of going into the imaginal realm through active imagination. And that process of active imagination is one of focusing on an image or turning an emotion that's arising, looking for the image that underlies it, and then in a way imaginally entering into that scene and becoming part of it. And it seems that at least for part of the time, Jung was probably writing at the same time that he was doing this, but it may not be always. Again, this is debatable. There's a wonderful book called The Lament of the Dead that is a dialogue between Sonu Shamdasani and James Hillman, and where they're discussing psychology after the Red Book. And in that dialogue, they're discussing exactly this question that you're asking. What exactly was Jung's process in this? And it seems some of it was writing. Just knowing my own experiences working with the imagination, sometimes I find it can be harder to go fully into an active imagination while writing. I think it just depends on the scene and how one is participating and what's going on. Certainly the great flood vision that Jung had on the train, he wasn't writing. That was a waking vision that just came to him spontaneously. Whereas in early 1916, when Jung wrote the Seven Sermons of the Dead, when there were all of these poltergeist phenomena happening in his house, and he sat down and kind of in this very intense period of writing, wrote these 7 sermons that actually were initially spoken in the voice of the figure Philemon, which is the kind of wise old man.
We're going to get to Philemon now. I just want to close out the ritual bit, because Philemon is going to be interesting for the Tolkien nerds out there for reasons you mentioned in your presentation that I completely missed and I thought was very cool. But it's interesting that Jung had, as we know, like a particular interest in the Gnostics and other kind of previous esoteric and mystical groups in the West. And this sort of semi-automatic writing thing that we presume he did, it matches quite well to sort of Renaissance magicians like Marsilio Ficino and Giordano Bruno and even Campanella, where it was this imaginal exploration that as you say, sometimes it's more difficult to write while performing the exercises, but also sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's funnily, it makes more sense to be able to almost distract or tune out the physical world by a fairly simple process. And that's interesting to me. And the space that it happened in late in the evening, and also in a tower, you can tell, well, someone with sort of magical ritual experience can tell that Jung was making it up as he went along in the right way. Like, he was looking for, how is this going to work? Is it going to work like this? Did this helped, this didn't? And you see something build for someone who's interested in the history of magic, especially over the 20th century. Mm-hmm. One of the most important magical books written was the Red Book. And we only just, as you say, we only got it a few years ago. And it's probably one of the longest magical rituals that people have performed for, 2,000 years, perhaps. And it involves all those pieces. It involves time of day, time of night, location, physical, imaginal. And it's sort of little wonder that he ends up with this remarkable journey of an inner or imaginal landscape.
Yes, it is such a difficult book to sum up. And what Jung is doing with the Red Book is I mean, it's so hard to definitively say. It is a record of his journeys through the imaginal. There are multiple layers to the Red Book, which Shamdasani has differentiated for us. There's the visions that were written out in the black books initially, and then carefully transcribed with this beautiful calligraphy into the Red Book itself, the leather-bound medieval-style manuscript of the Red Book. And on the one hand, it has this quality to it that feels like a sacred text. And I think Jung would have been very clear, and probably this is part of why he was so hesitant to have it published, that this isn't revelation. This isn't a prophecy for others to take up. This is not a new Bible, but rather it's the record of a method. It's a record of a spiritual path that isn't the end point. It's kind of this invitation for, I think the Red Book is an invitation for everyone to be able to make their own Red Book.
Yeah, it's do as I do, not as I say. The Red Book is a Carl-specific map of a world that we can have entry to.
Yes.
All right, so Philemon, because I really like this. Who is Philemon, and how does that relate to the Lord of the Rings or Middle Earth?
Well, in the Red Book, when we first meet Philemon, it actually seems that it's rather far into the book itself. It's in the section called The Magician, and that's when this figure of Philemon starts to become differentiated. But as you keep going in the Red Book, or as Jung keeps going in his process, he realizes that much of what he had written in the earlier parts of the Red Book, in Liber Primus and Liber Secundus, that is written in this very kind of prophetic voice, he's realizing that that's not him who is saying that, but rather that these are Philemon's words, and he's only later recognizing who this is, and that the figure of Philemon in many ways differentiated out of the figure Elijah, who Jung meets much earlier in the Red Book. And so there's this kind of shift and change taking place. But what Elijah and what Philemon and what this prophetic voice all have in common is that they are this wise elder. And it's interesting that Jung introduces Philemon in the section called The Magician. And as one of my dissertation advisors, Craig Chalquist, has pointed out, he feels that Philemon is not actually a magician, but is instead this kind of wise elder, this wise old man that is a kind of different archetypal character than the magician. And what's such an interesting parallel with Tolkien is that Gandalf is, of course, also this wise old man, this elder that is a guide. And we meet Gandalf, page 1 of The Hobbit, which some would say, well, that's the very beginning of the story. But actually, that's not quite true, because Tolkien had been writing stories of Middle-earth for almost 2 decades before Gandalf showed up. And so it's this interesting parallel where, in a way, Philemon's there from the beginning, Gandalf was there from the beginning, but they're also not there from the beginning. And the reason I'm bringing up this difference between the magician and the wise elder, the wise old man, is because Tolkien also differentiates what a magician is from what a wizard is, what one of the Astari are, and those wizard figures, those wise old figures in the Lord of the Rings are, of course, Gandalf and Saruman and Radagast, and then the two blue wizards who we never hear of ever again and wonder where they went. And I think that differentiation has to do with what Tolkien describes as the difference between enchantment and magic. And magic is much more the province of power and manipulation and technology, and what Sauron, the Dark Lord, is much more drawn toward utilizing power over others. Whereas enchantment is something different. Enchantment is what the elves express themselves through. There's something deep about enchantment. There's something about the earth itself that is enchanted. And it's not about power over or manipulation, but rather enchantment has to do with art and wisdom. And I think that is ultimately what Philemon is expressing as well, that he isn't really a magician, and it seems to maybe take Jung some time to realize that about Philemon, in the same way that it may have taken Tolkien some time to realize that about Gandalf. And you don't see Gandalf doing all these flashy spells and changing the course of history through force, through magic. You know, you do see his wonderful fireworks that are bright colors and declare that Gandalf is here, but that's kind of the most of the magic that he's doing. And rather, he's working with enchantment. He's working with relationship and friendship and making connections, allowing the inherent power within the people themselves to be able to defend and take care of their home, their freedom, their landscape, etc.
Yeah. Also, the one interpretation of the fireworks thing is because he had the Ring of Fire. So when you see him perform magic, Tolkien has the get out clause, which is, well, actually, that's the power of the ring that he possessed that we only find out at the end, because it's all the flashy stuff is fire related, and the rare instances that he uses it, or fire and light related. But when he's sort of putting the mountain to sleep, that's enchantment and re-enchantment. And it's interesting in both cases. What I liked about them is that you don't really get the impression that either of them. So if you take Gandalf in The Hobbit, I don't care what Tolkien says. He didn't realize that he had an angel when he had his wizard in that children's story. He had a wizard going on doing grumpy wizardly things, more or less. And Jung had the same journey to realize, well, actually, I think this advisor you mentioned is correct, that something much bigger expands behind what appears to be the magician in both cases. Because Philemon fascinates me. I mean, Jung, during his Gnostic obsessions, thought Philemon was a stand-in for, or one of the church fathers, and so a kind of route in through that kind of early church wisdom. And we can talk about archetypes if you want, but of all the things that he encountered, quote unquote, in his head, it strikes me that Philemon's the one that he's, that's the one that is least Jung. That's the one that seems to have the most independent agency, at least, or to the point that Jung struggles to nail him down the most, because it just keeps opening up and offering additional layers. And for Tolkien nerds, that's exactly what happens with Gandalf as you go through the kind of stories of Middle-earth, and even sort of out of sequence, because you get the Maiar and the Istari and sort of where something like Gandalf fits in creation afterwards, when you get the Silmarillion and so on.
Yes. And there's this also beautiful thing with Gandalf's first name, the name that he bore in the West when he was a Maiar, before he took on Gandalf's body. And that name is Olorin, and that comes from the Quenya word Olor, which relates to dream, vision, fantasy, and not in the sense of a sleeping dream, but a waking dream. And so how interesting is it that Gandalf's original name has to do with, many ways, the whole practice of active imagination that is so characterized by who Philemon is.
Yeah, see, it rocked my world looking at that presentation, because I couldn't believe I had not... It takes someone to point out, and this is the talent of doing something highly original. It takes someone to point out something that as soon as you see it, you go, well, that's really obvious, but it's not until it's pointed out. The Philemon Gandalf spectrum, I think, is particularly interesting.
It's a beautiful parallel that keeps unfolding too, and as I'm still so much in the process of doing this research, and I'm literally writing my dissertation right now.
Oh, cool.
And so you are conversing with me as I'm kind of in the world and still figuring out the questions that I'm asking, as much as the answers I'm finding. And there are such amazing Tolkien scholars and such amazing Jungian scholars that I'm so enjoying being able to draw on all the research that they've done, and really I'm looking for the parallels, but it's incredible how much profound work has already been done. Verlyn Flieger, who is one of my favorite Tolkien scholars ever, I so respect her work and the way she writes about Middle-earth from the inside, that she takes this world as real in many ways and addresses it in the way that I feel it deserves. It's in her work that she drew forward the origins of Gandalf's name, of Olorin, and that tie with the language. But it was as I was reading that alongside reading Jung's Red Book and learning who Philemon was, that it was like, there's yet another parallel. And that's been the beauty of this project, is just, it's like watching flowers bloom, and I just get to be a witness in many ways and record that.
No, you're underselling that. I think you're on a journey of doing something that's going to be extremely important for weirdo nerds out there, because I think, it's remarkable stuff. And funnily enough, it seems to have that same humble kind of drop in from the imaginal component by looking at the Red Book and you seeing, well, this is a thing that now exists in reality that I know comes from the imaginal, and to go in that is quite impressive. So hang on. The scholar you were talking about, name currently escapes me, but I've got some of her stuff.
Verlyn Flieger.
Yeah, she was the one who quoted Slavoj Žižek about Tolkien, I think, where he said only a devout Christian could have imagined such a magnificent pagan universe, thereby confirming that paganism is the ultimate Christian dream. It's very him, but it sort of speaks to that. It only looks contradictory if you look at the surface of Tolkien's life and his Catholicism and the kind of amazing landscape, the internal landscape that he encountered and sort of invites other people into, because it doesn't... I know that was Žižek being Žižek, but it does kind of accidentally speak towards the what I presume is the thesis you're working on now, which is there are quite a few overlaps in the imaginal landscape between the two. And so if we talk about, let's close out the Tolkien stuff by talking on fairy stories and Smith of Wooten Major. So as Tolkien's coming towards, particularly Smith of Wooten Major, but he's coming towards the end of his life, and the Silmarillion is still unfinished, and he stops to write something that seems sort of fairly innocuous fiction. But it's kind of a trick. So do we want to... Not really a trick, but there's more to it than meets the eye. So do we want to talk about that?
I would love to. What direction would you like to go with this?
Let's just describe Smith of Wooten Major, and then let's speculate as to how that may relate to how he saw Middle-earth, and he saw the role of myth and imagination.
Well, Smith of Wooten Major is a story that Tolkien started writing when he was asked to write an introduction for another story. And true to Tolkien's nature, he decided to give an example story within this introduction. And that was the beginning of Smith of Wooten Major. And instead, he abandoned the introduction. That never got finished, like so many other of his projects.
Nightmare. This.
Oh. Yes.
Lord of the Rings is a sequel to a children's book. I mean, this is just the publisher's nightmare. Anyway, carry on.
It is. I'll just add to that too that there's this other parallel in Jung's Red Book and in Tolkien's approach to his own mythology, that both were so compelled to pour so much energy and revision into these projects, and neither really knew if they would be published. And so, of course, Jung's Red Book was published much later, after his death, and so was the majority of Tolkien's stories published after his death. And I think that is an indication of part of what's going on, that it is this very internal struggle with this material for each of them. And I don't think The Lord of the Rings would have seen print either if it weren't for C.S. Lewis, who I really believe is the literary midwife of this particular book, that he sat with Tolkien, reading out loud chapters again and again and again. And he was just this force of encouragement to Tolkien to bring this out into the world. And so I really do think we owe C.S. Lewis so much thanks that we have this remarkable book published, and that it was published during Tolkien's lifetime, because he did have this tendency to rewrite and rework things to the point that they just would not see final print. And he was notorious for that. So he abandoned this introduction that he was supposed to write and instead wrote this little story, Smith of Wooten Major, about this, what starts out as a child smith who gets a star that turns out to be a fairy star. He eats it in a piece of cake, and there's a whole story behind the great cake that is baked every 24 years in this little village. And the star, he coughs it back up and claps it onto his forehead. And it's kind of like a third eye in many ways, that star on his forehead. And what that star is, that fairy star, is a passport that allows him to cross the threshold into the realm of fairy. And so throughout his life, throughout his adult life, he passes back and forth into this realm. And it's so interesting in the story how you never quite are told where the entrance to fairy is, what crossing that threshold is like. And I've noticed this as a theme in many different stories. In Harry Potter, when he crosses the threshold at platform 9 3/4 to get onto the train to Hogwarts, or when Lucy Pevensey crosses through the wardrobe into Narnia. You never can track the exact moment of crossing the threshold. It's like all the senses become blind, especially sight, and then suddenly you're in a new world, in a different world. You're in fairy. And so Smith of Wooten Major has that same kind of subtlety to it, where when Smith crosses between what we could call the primary world, the real world, and fairy, the secondary world. Although I do feel there's something very primary about fairy, but can get into that in a different way or at a different time. And so on his journeys through fairy, Smith, probably the most important encounter he has is first with this beautiful young maiden who he dances with. And in his final visit to fairy, he meets her again and realizes that she is not simply this this young kind of elven maiden, but she is the queen of fairy. And it's actually the scholar Lance Owens, who is an expert on Jung's relationship to Gnosticism, and who has also noticed the parallel between the two red books, and we've been in contact discussing these parallels over the last couple of years. He did a series of lectures on Tolkien and on imagination, and he points out how this figure, the Queen of Fairy, that Smith discovers, that Smith meets in this world, is in many ways like Sophia. She is wisdom. She is the goddess of wisdom, and also comparable to the anima, the female expression, personification of soul that Jung discovers. And so in many ways, this figure that Smith meets in fairy is like his anima figure, but also as Sophia, I feel, could even be seen as encountering the anima mundi, the divine wisdom that is the ensouled nature of our cosmos, of our world. And so I'm overlapping a few different ideas in here. I'm describing Smith of Wooten Major and the Queen of Fairy, and Lance Owens' Gnostic reading of that with her.
It's brilliant. So how does Smith of Wooten Major end?
Well, after meeting the Queen of Fairy, Smith returns to his home, and he has been told that he has to give up the star, and that it's meant to be passed on to another child to be able to cross over into this realm. And there is speculation by several different Tolkien scholars, and I agree with this, that this seems to be somewhat autobiographical, that Tolkien was granted this passage into fairy, into the imaginal realm, that seems to really have been catalyzed in the beginning, in those years, 1911, 1913, with the images in the Book of Vishnus, and then as the mythology just bursts through him in those early years, and then of course with the writing of The Lord of the Rings and in the late 30s and throughout the 1940s. And that as he was getting older, he started to lose access to that realm, and he so badly wanted to publish the Silmarillion and to revise those stories, and he wasn't able to. And it seems like maybe it was because he wasn't able to enter back into that realm of fairy, into the imagination, to be able to revise the stories as he wanted them to be told. And so the project in many ways was abandoned. And there is this great sense of sadness and melancholy in that loss.
And it's interesting the thing that Smith gives up, because I agree that the reading is... I agree with the autobiographical reading, but it's interesting that what Smith gives up is the passport. He doesn't give up the land. The fairy still exists, and that's where I think there's the trick in Smith of Wooten Major, which is I think the autobiographical thing is sound, but Tolkien isn't passing on the torch of Middle Earth. He's not passing on the torch of the imaginal. No one else gets to be the king of it. He's saying someone else needs to put the star in the forehead and go there. It's still there. Which brings us, interestingly, when you said about whether fairy is preeminent, you're not alone in that. I mean, Tolkien said it contained more than, elves and dragons. It also contained men and trees and bread, and I forget the actual quote, but it's, when we're enchanted, it's, there's what he thought of as fairy is a very interesting and frankly better description than something like, those elevated elements of the collective unconscious. So what do you think about this? We'll move into a fascinating topic, by way of what you think fairy is, moving into imaginal ecology.
Well, yes, I do quite love that that quote that you were just bringing up right now. It actually makes me want to try and find it and read it, if that's all right.
Yeah, do.
I think I could find it quite quickly, actually. So the quote is, and this is from Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. Fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarfs, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, or I would say mortal humans, when we are enchanted. And I think that's so important. That's so key to what fairy is, because fairy is the real world around us. And when we allow ourselves as human beings to look at it through enchanted eyes, then we recognize that all of those other things are there too. And that in many ways it's almost like the rational human being, the post-enlightenment human being has rounded up all of these enchanted figures, the elves and fairies, the witches, and the capacity to do magic, and dragons and unicorns. All of these things have been rounded up and put somewhere. And that place that they've been put is the imagination. And then we've decided, well, now that's no longer real. That doesn't exist. And it's kind of like someone has locked it away. And what Tolkien was able to do, and I think what Jung was able to do too in his own process of active imagination, is enter back into that world and discover where all of these things that we've decided are no longer real are now living. And I think the process of re-enchantment that is being taken up in so many different disciplines now, as we're realizing that the reductionist materialist paradigm is failing us in many ways, and is allowing us in all ways. I mean, I do feel like it served a purpose, that we have learned so much about the world that we were maybe meant to learn. And as my father, actually, Richard Tarnas, has said, why did we disenchant the world? Or why did we disenchant the cosmos? Or maybe, to put it in a better way, why did the cosmos disenchant itself through us? And maybe that is part of the larger arc, the larger process that is taking place. And so the materialist reductionist paradigm is a paradigm that no longer works, but it did work. It was liberating once. And I think what it did liberate us from, by us, I mean, I'm so grounded in a Western, European American context that I can only speak from that place, but I don't want to universalize experience, because awakening to diversity is so essential. And so such a key part of our moment in history right now. But from speaking from my own lineage, my own background, and what I have come to understand, that this disenchantment had to take place to kind of free ourselves from the dogma of superstition, and in many ways what was so destructive with religious wars, and of course that is still going on. But that materialist reductionist paradigm did have a purpose to serve. And so I do want to honor that. And as we let it go and come into a re-enchanted perspective, I think part of that is unlocking that door to the perilous realm again, to the imagination, to fairy, and walking through and acknowledging that everything that is there is real. But what real means at this stage in human history and in cosmic history is maybe a little different than what real meant in a materialist paradigm.
Well said. Well said. So that tees up imaginal ecology quite well, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I coined this term, imaginal ecology, toward the end of my master's degree because, well, I was realizing that there is a profound relationship between what ecology is and what the imagination is. And this was really inspired by one of my teachers, Joanna Macy, who's this wonderful eco-philosopher and activist and Buddhist scholar. And she said, I was in a class with her, she said, one cannot see relationship with the physical eyes. One can only perceive relationship with the eye of the imagination. And she meant, of course, that the physical eyes won't tell us when you see two people walking down the street if they're lovers or if they're siblings or father and daughter, or that's not told. But the imagination can perceive, and I think there's an overlap here of imagination and intuition, can perceive what that relationship is. And that just started me thinking about, well, what's our definition of ecology? And ecology is the study of relationships between other organisms and between other organisms and their environment. And of course, an environment, as you look more closely at it, is just more relationships between more and more organisms. And so ecology is just this vast network of relationship. How do we come to understand that? Well, we can really only come to understand relationship through the eye of the imagination. And I thought, well, it feels like there's something very deeply connected here. And as I started looking at all of the work of different people who'd inspired me, people who are engaging with the ecological crisis and with bringing a new re-enchanted perspective to cosmology and how we understand our universe as not a static cosmos, but a cosmogenesis, an evolution of cosmic history. I realized that to be able to view the Earth this way, the universe this way, really requires tuning into the imaginal, and that there is this profound overlap and relationship between the two, and that we will really only be able to heal the, in many ways, very disconnected and destructive relationship that the human species, the industrialized human being, has to the earth, to other species, if we can enter into our empathic and our moral imagination and recognize that we're all in relationship, that we cannot exploit, that we cannot extract other beings as resources. For example, I will not use the word resource to refer to any being that I relate to anymore, even as I continue to be in a relationship with it, such as with food or with wood or something that is building, that becomes part of my own human habitat, my own human ecosystem. I cannot think of other ecological beings as resources anymore. It's just not possible when you open the imaginal eye and you recognize, these are sentient beings just like I am.
Yeah, I love that. So it's re-enchantment of the world and the natural world in particular in this case. And it also runs the risk of, rewilding the forest with unicorns from the imaginal.
Yes. And in doing that, it's what that means takes on, it has a different definition in a way of what real is, what
exactly
that kind of real rewilding is actually taking place.
And it gets back to what you were saying about whether the sort of last 200 or so years of the last round trip through materialism, whether that was necessary or not. I don't know if Gary Lachman's been on the show as well. I don't know if you've read his most recent book, Secret Teachers of the West. And he sort of talks about this idea as well, that it was probably a necessary detour on the way back to re-enchanting, because we've come back with some cool toys. We've come back with improved notions of equality and all these other things that we may have got to far slower if we hadn't had that split and had that split away from some of the ideas and dogmas and superstitions you were talking about. So there's a very real opportunity, and it's not a moment too soon to restore the imaginal or restore us to the imaginal after sort of taking 2 centuries off to almost destroy the planet, but come back with a few nice things that probably need to be plugged in.
Yeah, it's how do I put this? It's like that that splitting had to take place so that the individual could be born. And as the individual emerges out of an enchanted matrix, out of the pagan and then the Christian worldviews in the West, as the individual is forged through modernity and through the Enlightenment and through that materialist shift, that allows for all of these other, for that diversity that I was referring back to come forward. And one example of this that I've been thinking about lately is that when you have man emerge from, as an individual, from the kind of collective idea of man, because this is very common and surprisingly still common usage, that we refer to the whole human species as man or men. And as the individual is forged and the individual man comes forward from the collective man, suddenly you have individual women looking at that and saying, wait, that doesn't represent me. And then feminism is able to be born. Or you have this kind of the Eurocentric patriarchal tradition that is kind of taking this universal perspective on the human, or again on man, and you have all of these other cultures that are also recognizing themselves as individuals and saying, wait, this doesn't represent me either. And so suddenly this diversity of voices is coming forward. And
there's something like on a full-blown spiritual level, like viewing it hermetically, if you will, when we observe the natural universe, diversity is always good. Lack of diversity is always bad. It is the same with your microbiome in your stomach. It's the same with a reef. The more, the healthier. And it is interesting. I can kind of, we don't have the words for it yet because it's an ongoing process. But I really like what you're saying there, because it has allowed us, it will allow us to return to match diversity with diversity, and who knows what will come of that. Presumably more diversity.
Yes, it's in diversity that we are able to ecologically find stability, and for evolution to take place, and in ways that are life enhancing for the whole complex system. And I think in many ways the human species is undergoing that process now, and there's so much struggle around this at the moment, and I'm very conscious of my inability to articulate this in a way that it may feel universally applicable. And so I'm just noticing within myself, okay, I'm struggling with how to express this because I don't want to speak for anyone else when it comes to diversity. And I think that's part of the moment that we're in too, of how do we discuss these ideas? How do we not silence ourselves and at the same time create the space for it to be safe, or at least safer for the many suppressed voices to come forward and tell their own stories. And I recognize my own privilege in being able to, address these particular ideas and being, getting the education I've had and so forth. And I think that maybe one of the most important lessons that those with privilege have to take in right now is, how do we learn how to listen again? And not, how does listening not become a shamed silence, but rather just allowing the voices of those who haven't had the opportunities to tell their own stories. How do we allow that to emerge?
I was going to say something basically the same, which is diversity is diversifying. And just the fact that we're kind of conscious of saying that, we're talking about it from a specific milieu, but there are other voices that will come in, is a step that diversity has gone on to diversify. And it's a longer process on the journey home, but in that respect, it's at least this is how I interpret it. Yes, it's traumatic and causing, all kinds of stuff, because what we're doing as a planet is difficult. And it's not an overnight solve, but in that diversifying of diversity sense, I hope and feel we're moving in the right direction.
Yes, as Martin Luther King says, the arc of the universe does bend toward justice, and it feels to me like humanity at this very profound moment in time is going through a process of death and rebirth. And, well, we'll see if the rebirth is coming.
Yeah.
it does feel like that kind of profound rite of passage or initiation is taking place. And so many new things are emerging as so many old things are dying. And being able to honor what's dying and being able to nourish what is emerging at the same time, it really does feel like our task at this moment in history.
Well, Becca, that is a wonderful thing to end it on. For everyone, and I mean everyone who has been listening with rapt fascination to this, where might they go to find out more about your good self?
I have a website. It's just my name, beccatarnas.com. And I post all of my writings and paintings and other things that I like to spend my time creating there. And I can be reached through that as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, well, thank you too. It's such an honor, and I so enjoyed this conversation, and really just I'm very, very touched by you reaching out and being able to share these ideas and work through them in dialogue too.
So, if you've been following Rune Soup for a while, you're probably asking yourself how I'm possibly going to sum up this chat with Becca. It's got so many of my favorite things in it. It's got the Red Book, it's got Tolkien, it's got the re-enchantment of an animist universe. This has to be one of my favorite episodes, and I have to thank Becca for her patience whilst I got it out the door. I wanted to have the episode with Miguel out just before it, so that Becca and my discussion of the imaginal can be positioned in the context of Gnostic, Hermetic, and generally magical practice. For anyone who is interested, these 2 episodes are a really good jumping off point if you want to go deeper into a more sophisticated understanding of myth and storytelling, and also what magicians should be meaning when they use the word imagination in the first place. If that sounds like your jam, then you should totally subscribe to the show on iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or on YouTube. And let's keep the discussion going on the blog, runesoup.com, or the Facebook page, or you can chat to me directly on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.